On the night when the sky lost its courage, the sea rose like a faceless army, crushing cliffs, watchtowers, and human promises beneath liquid walls of a fury that did not belong to any ordinary storm. The lightning did not streak across the horizon. They looked like open scars on the body of the darkness. And at the heart of this cataclysm, a name resonated in the depths like an ancient decree: Poseidon. He was not the festive god of marble statues eroded by salt, nor the tamed figure of poems recited at perfumed banquets. He was the brutal sovereign of the submerged world, lord of the trenches where light drowns, guardian of the monsters that sleep with one eye open beneath the mud of the abyss. In that dark hour, ships did not sink like wood, they sank like sins. Each broken mast seemed like a knee bending before an offended deity. Each torn sail recalled the skein of proud kings, ripped away by the invisible hand of fate. Poseidon rose from the depths of the ocean as one who emerges from a tomb older than time itself. His hair was tangled with black seaweed. His shoulders bore the weight of broken chains, and his eyes held the colour of what men see a moment before they die at sea. The trident in his hand was not a weapon, it was a sentence. When its tip sliced through the water, the ocean obeyed with the fierce discipline of an empire of merciless creatures, and even the sharks altered their course, like servants making way for fear itself. But it was not only anger that carved furrows into his divine face. There was something else, a deep unease, a viscous omen, a call coming from regions so ancient that not even the Titans dared to speak their names aloud. In the most remote bed of the world, beneath drowned cities and the skeletons of leviathans, something pulsed. It was not fish, nor god, nor monster. It was a formless hunger, sealed away before Olympus, imprisoned beneath layers of water and forgetting. And Poseidon knew. He knew the sea did not roar out a whim. He knew the currents changed direction like terrified herds. He knew the whales sang funeral notes and that the underwater volcanoes trembled like servants on the verge of betrayal. For the first time in countless ages, the Lord of the Oceans tasted the bitter flavour of doubt. Not the fear that paralyzes men, but the fear that humiliates gods, the fear of finding in the depths something that does not bow, something that reveres neither throne nor crown nor lightning. And when the first coastal city vanished without a scream, without a body, without a trace of ruin, Poseidon gripped his trident so tightly that the water around him began to boil. For he understood, all too late, that on that night it was not the sea that needed its lord, but the Lord himself who would be judged by the sea. Long before men began tossing coins into the sea and calling it devotion, Poseidon already ruled the liquid realm with a severity that no mortal could recount without trembling. His palace, built among pillars of dark coral and the bones of colossal creatures, was less a court and more a fortress surrounded by crushing silence. There, where the pressure would crush the chest of any living being, the god walked among gardens of pale anemones and halls lit by the sickly glow and eyeless fish. There was no cheerful music in his abode. There were the clanking of chains, the echoes of compressed waters, and the whisper of memories the ocean never returned to the surface. Poseidon was not loved like Apollo, not revered with the noble distance of Athena. He was feared, and he knew the taste of that fear as a king knows the metal of his own crown. The fear of men nourished him, but did not console him. For eternity, when crossed alone, rots even glory. Amidst armed Tritons and Nereids with wary gazes, the god bore a wounded majesty. His pride was as vast as the open ocean, but within him fermented ancient losses, quarrels with Zeus, grudges never laid to rest, cities that had forgotten him, children taken by the very violence of fate. It was then that the darkest omens arrived. Entire shoals appeared dead, spinning in the tide like cursed silver. Sacred springs dried up. Islands heard voices coming from saltwater wells. And in the very early hours of the morning, fishermen returned with completely empty nets, and hair turned white from terror. Poseidon realized he would not be facing a human rebellion, nor the usual insolence of kings. The enemy moved beneath the world, breathing in forgotten crevices, pushing the sea from within like a foreign heart trying to be born from a divine corpse. Before we dive into this journey through darkness, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this story, and support this shadowy journey so I can keep bringing you powerful, intense, and unforgettable tales drawn from the depths of imagination. And I want to see you here with me until the end. Let me know in the comments which city and state you're watching from, because every voice that arrives from afar lights a torch in this night filled with sea, ruin, and wounded deities. Now take a deep breath, because the waters are about to part, not to reveal treasures, but scars. What is about to emerge is not a luminous fable. It is a tragedy of salt, pride, and damnation, led by a god who will discover that even the mightiest of rulers can bleed. This is the story of Poseidon, when the ocean, his throne and his sword, ceased to obey as a servant and began to face him as a judge. And no sentence is crueler than the one pronounced by creation itself against the hand that rules it. When news of the vanished city reached the submerged palace, it did not come with trumpets, but in the mutilated body of a sacred hippocamp dragged by the currents. The creature bore deep grooves in its scales, as if stone claws had gouged its flesh while it was still alive. Poseidon knelt before the agonizing animal, and the Nereids around him drew back. Not out of disgust, but out of reverence for the god's silence. He touched the brow of the wounded messenger and, in a brutal flash, received fragmented visions. Towers being pulled under, streets swallowed without a trace of foam, drowned bells ringing beneath the dark water. The city had not been destroyed by wave, earthquake, or fire. It had been torn from the coast like a rotten tooth. No wall had withstood, no temple remained. All that was left was a circle of black water, still as an open eye staring at the sky. Furious, Poseidon struck the floor of the hall with his trident. The cracks spread across the sea marble and made the Tritons stagger. But after the crash, something worse followed. An underground echo answered the blow. Not a sound, a response. Amphitrite watched her husband from the top of the coral steps, noticing what the others dared not admit. What unsettled Poseidon was not just anger, but recognition, as if a shadow buried in ancient times had heard its name and awoken with resentment. The god ordered Dolphin, the swiftest among his messengers, to summon Proteus, the old knower of the sea's shifting forms. If there was memory in the currents, Proteus possessed it. If there was a secret in the tides, he'd already sniffed it out with the weariness of one who'd survived many ages. Proteus came, dragging old age behind him like a sodden net. His milky, deep-set eyes did not look at Poseidon with submission, but with the bitter intimacy of one who knows the fragility behind greatness. Upon hearing the account of what had happened, he did not turn pale. He did worse, he bowed his head. "I feared I would hear that silence again," he murmured. And he recounted that before the order of the Olympian gods ruled the cosmos, there existed beneath the sea a prison made of canyons, volcanic chains, and oaths. There, an entity called the shadowy Nereus had been sealed away, not the ancient wise sea god of the songs, but a primal hunger clothed in consciousness. According to Proteus, this being did not devour flesh, it devoured dominion. It drained the authority from things, tore the kingdom from the king, the sanctity from the temple, the obedience from the sea. Wherever it passed, creation forgot who ruled over it. And if it were free, the ocean would no longer recognize Poseidon as its lord. For the first time, the god felt that his trident weighed more than divine metal ever should. Not because his strength had waned, but because the very sea around him seemed to hear that revelation and falter. And for a sovereign like Poseidon, nothing was more obscene than the hesitation of that which had always bowed to him. Poseidon departed alone. Neither Amphitrite nor Triton, nor the escorts of marine warriors could accompany him beyond the arch of the trenches, a region where the water became so dense it seemed like dark glass crushing everything that dared to cross it. As he descended, the colours faded away. The blue turned to lead, the green rotted into black, and the glow of abyssal fish appeared like lanterns in a funeral procession. There the ocean had no beauty. It had entrails. Amidst submerged mountains and craters spewing mineral smoke, the god found the remains of the vanished city. They were not destroyed, but rearranged. The houses had been stacked in concentric circles. The marble statues stared towards the centre, like worshippers forced to adore something invisible. In the main temple, priests and citizens lay preserved within the water, motionless, their eyes open. No wound had torn their bodies, but their faces were empty of identity, like masks abandoned by souls that had forgotten their own names. Poseidon passed through toppled columns and found on the altar a symbol carved with monstrous precision, an eye surrounded by broken chains. Upon seeing it, ancient memories broke the seal of time. He remembered the Primordial War when he helped seal the entity in the depths and swore never to speak of it. Forgetting had not been an accident, but a strategy. The gods hid the existence of that horror to prevent any cult from strengthening it. But the world of men had a knack for unearthing ruins, misinterpreting fragments, and kneeling before what should have remained unnameable. Then the voices came. Not from outside, but from within the water, sliding around Poseidon like liquid serpents. They called him usurper, borrowed king, lord crowned upon fragile currents. Each word slid into his ear like cold poison. The god advanced to the central square, where a colossal fissure gaped in the ground of the drowned city. From it emanated a deep pulse, like the beating of a heart buried within the crust of the world. All around, the currents spun in defiance of the laws of the sea. When Poseidon drove his trident into the ground beside the opening, the darkness below him stirred. No body emerged, but an absence of form, an impossible outline, something that seemed made of dead waters, dissolved faces, and ruins of voices. And that presence smiled without a mouth. "You reign because I slept," whispered the entity in the god's mind. Poseidon did not retreat, but he felt the ocean floor tremble with the cruelest truth of that descent. He was not facing an enemy who merely wished to win. He was facing something that wished to deny his very existence. The first blow came from Poseidon. His trident came down like a drowned bolt of lightning, splitting the water into 3 luminous gashes. The impact crushed ruins, raised a wall of sediment, and sent entire shoals bursting apart in shattered silver. But the entity had no flesh to be torn. It dissolved into black currents, passed through the attack, and reappeared behind the godlike mist rising from a sunken graveyard. Then it struck not at his body, but at his authority. Suddenly, the waters around him ceased to obey. The sea, which had always responded to Poseidon's slightest gesture, hesitated like a horse that no longer recognizes its own rider. The currents twisted against him, whipping his shoulders, coiling around his trident, denying him the instinctive response of command. That hurt more than any blade, for a god can endure pain, but is driven nearly mad when his very essence is challenged. Poseidon roared, and the sound echoed through the trenches, splitting rocks and awakening hidden monsters. Even so, the water's rebellion persisted. Dark near us took the form of dozens of dissolved human faces, faces of kings, sailors, children, and priests. They all spoke at once. They accused Poseidon of shipwrecks, droughts, earthquakes, and cruel whims. These were voices gathered over ages of resentment. For the first time, the god faltered. not because the accusations were entirely false, but because human resentment had been preserved at the bottom of the world like poisonous sludge. That creature fed on what Poseidon had left behind: pain, arrogance, destruction, and worship through fear. The entity wrapped itself around the god's arm, and wherever it touched, the divine skin cracks like rock under a brutal winter. A thread of golden blood trickled into the dark water. The entire ocean felt it. Whales stopped their song. Underwater volcanoes roared. The sea realized that its lord could bleed. Poseidon fell to one knee among broken columns. The sight of his own blood opened within him a forgotten chamber of humiliation. He remembered the contest for the city of Athens, his defeat at the hands of Athena, the lost temples, the prayers that were offered to other gods while he sank into fury. It was then that he understood he would not defeat dark Nereus with pride. The creature was made precisely from that which his pride had fed. Every time he had ruled through terror, he had left a fragment of himself available to that abyss. Every ancient cruelty was now ammunition against his own throne. Struggling to his feet, Poseidon closed his hand over the golden blood and smeared it along the prongs of his trident. Not as a gesture of power, but as a confession. If the sea was about to judge him, he would step into the court as both defendant and king. And that decision made the water around him tremble in a different way. When Poseidon rose to his feet again, there was no longer the arrogance of an offended sovereign on his face, but the silent hardness of someone who had finally seen his own reflection without the disguise of glory. The sea around him sensed this change even before a single word was spoken. Instead of commanding, the god called out. He did not demand obedience from the currents, he asked them to listen to him. He did not brandish the trident as an absolute scepter, but planted it before him as a witness. Confused water swirled slowly, as if an entire empire were holding its breath. Shadowy Nereus laughed with 1,000 waterlogged voices. He tried once more to strike him with ghosts of guilt, conjuring up images of ruined ships, grieving mothers, cities shattered by earthquakes, and fishermen dragged into nameless trenches. They were crimes, excesses, acts of vengeance. It was the poisonous biography of a tempestuous god. Poseidon did not deny a single vision. He accepted them one by one. Each image pierced his chest like a slow harpoon, and by not resisting, he deprived the entity of its main source of sustenance. For horror thrived on denial, on pride, on the refusal of the guilty to acknowledge the damage they had caused. Then the god spoke to the ocean in a low voice, but one so heavy that the underwater mountains trembled. He said he had been both sovereign and executioner, protector and hangman. He said he had demanded fear when he should have sought reverence. He said he had turned the sea, which was both womb and pathway, into an instrument of vanity. The silence that followed was colossal. And in that silence, the waters began to return to him, not as cowering servants, but as creatures who choose, warm and cold currents intertwined around the trident. The deep tides aligned themselves. The ocean did not forget his cruelties, but it recognized his truth. Deprived of the lie that had strengthened him, dark Nereus shrank. His form lost its density. The human faces dissolved into spectral mud. Furious, he surged forward in one last assault, trying to swallow Poseidon and fuse him forever to his own shame. But now the god's blow came from somewhere else. When he raised the trident, the entire ocean moved with him. Not out of fear, but by consent. From the trenches, the reefs, the distant shores, and the forgotten glaciers, the whole watery vastness responded as a single awakened body. The trident came down. There was no explosion. There was sealing. Living currents wrapped around the entity, compressing it until its outline was reduced to a knot of throbbing darkness. The undersea mountains closed in over it, and the very seabed sealed the prison with layers of stone, salt, and memory. When it was all over, Poseidon stood motionless before the scarred fisher. He had won, yes, but he left there diminished in the eyes of vanity and greater before the truth. The ocean remained his kingdom, but from that night onwards, He understood that a lord of the seas does not rule merely by the strength of his arm, but by the weight of what he's willing to face within himself. They say that after that night, the sea never roared in quite the same way again. It remained fierce, it remained vast, it remained capable of breaking ships like twigs before a divine bonfire. But there was a new gravity about it, almost liturgical, as if each wave carried the memory of a judgment that took place where human eyes can never reach. Poseidon returned to his palace, but he did not return unscathed. No scar showed on his face, and yet the whole ocean knew that its king now bore a wound that cannot be closed by power, conscience. Amphitrite welcomed him without a question. Triton simply knelt. The Nereids lowered their eyes, and the god, who once demanded veneration like a merciless creditor, now walked among columns and currents with a silence heavier than any scream. He did not become gentle, he did not become meek. Gods do not so easily abandon their own nature, but his fury gained shape, and his punishment ceased to be mere whim, becoming instead a measured response to the insolence of the world. Even today, when the ocean darkens without wind and the horizon seems to hold its breath, the ancients would say that Poseidon is once again listening to the depths. Not out of fear of losing the throne, but so as never to forget that the true abyss does not dwell only beneath the waters. It grows silently within every power that believes itself absolute. And it was by facing this abyss without looking away that the Lord of the Seas remained king.